using the term dictatorial rule. And then in the next sentence, you speak of extremely repressive aspects of the Titoist regime. Does that mean that you believe that in the SFRY, Josip Broz Tito, the late president, though I don't consider that to have been a dictatorial regime, that he had virtually absolute authority, absolute power.
Yes, that was my impression, that he had absolute power, typical of many other communist leaders in other parts of the region at that time.
And do you know the nationality of the late President Tito?
I should know. I believe I know, but I'm not certain. I think he was a Croat, but I'm not certain.
He was a Croat. How then is it possible to speak of Serbian hegemony in a country in which, as you claim, absolute power over civilian and military authorities is in the hands of a Croat?
Well, until the period after Tito's death, I and many people in the world were not in the habit of thinking of the former Yugoslavia in terms of ethnic nationality. There were Yugoslavs, and I thought of Tito as a Yugoslav. I thought of my colleagues in Yugoslavia as Yugoslavs. They thought of themselves as Yugoslavs. It was only as the Federation began to break up that questions of specific ethnic identity became paramount, I think very unfortunately so.
We too did not pay too much attention to what ethnicity each one of us was, but do you know that throughout the period of existence of the Yugoslav Federation, that is for 47 years, the position of Prime Minister, Federal Prime Minister, throughout that period, which means half a century, was held by only one Serb for 4 years, from 64 to 67, and that all the others were not Serbs.
Well, let me go back, Mr. Milosevic, to your opening, the opening of your first question, when you quote from our report saying how the Croats felt about Serb hegemony. We were not saying that that was factually the case. We were trying to explain the attitudes that we heard, what people told us when we were there, to give some sense of what various ethnic groups were saying about each other. There was no intent or implication in that part of the report to say that this is what we thought. We were just saying Croats talked about many years of Serb hegemony. That was the way they seemed to see it, not the way we were saying it was, in fact.
Yes, but you put it in your report.
Yes, we did.
As some sort of a reason. Do you know that during this 47-year period...
I think you're mistaking, Mr. Milosevic. What the witness is saying, and we may be at cross purposes, what the witness is saying is that what they reported is what they were told. You understand that? Not that it's the truth or anything else. It's merely what they were told. You understand that?
Yes, yes. I understand completely. However, thereby a picture is being created that is wrong, and then on the basis of that picture, one says people said so. And do you know that after Tito's death, during the last 10 years of the existence of Yugoslavia, from 82 up till 92, the Prime Minister prime ministers were Croats, Milka Planinc, then Branko Mikulic, a Croat from Bosnia, and finally Ante Marković, a Croat from Croatia, as was Milka Planinc.
I don't have the report open in front of me, but I believe we told not just what the Croats were thinking and what they told us, but also what the Serbs told us. We were trying, in this part of the report, to explain a very complicated situation to people who were not living in the Federation, people outside in Europe and in the United States who wanted to get some understanding of what was happening there, and we were trying in our own simplest way to explain that.
The witness should have a copy of the report. It's tab 2, page 5.
The 1991 report.
May I continue, Mr. May?
The witness has got to the paragraph. September 1991, it should be tab 2, page 5, paragraph 2.
Actually, I have it now.
Yeah. Yes.
Dobro, da li znate da je Ustav
Do you know that the Constitution of Yugoslavia envisaged, among other things, the following? With respect to the composition of the command staff and the appointment to higher commands and leading positions in the Yugoslav People's Army, the principle of proportional representation of republics and autonomous provinces will be applied as much as possible. So that principle was observed, and the army was composed in harmony with the population structure of Yugoslavia. And do you also know that when the Yugoslav crisis broke out...
Let the witness answer. You produce these points and you never give a chance for the witness to answer. Do you know anything about this, Ms. Labour?
Description of the Constitution sounds correct as to my understanding of it, yes. I'm not sure about the composition. The actual composition of the army is another story.
And do you know that when the crisis broke out, the defense minister was General Veljko Kadijević, who comes from Croatia originally?
I'll take your word for that. I don't know that personally.
And do you know that the commander of the Air Force and anti-air defenses was also, at the beginning of the war, Antun Tus, a Croat, the most sophisticated part of the army. Later on he joined Tudjman's army, and then another general called Jurević took over, and he too was a Croat. Are you aware of any of these facts?
As I said before, I was not in the habit of thinking of Yugoslavs in terms of their ethnicity.
Do you know that there was general military service that was obligatory for all able-bodied young men, and again that there was proportional representation in accordance with the population, that is, the men of military age. Therefore, all ethnicities were represented proportionally. Are you aware of that?
I am not an expert on the military structure or of the Republic at that time.
Do you know that this proportional representation in the army was undermined only when Croatia and Slovenia, acting with the view to violent secession, called on the Croats and Slovenes not to serve in the army, and on Croatian and Slovenian officers to abandon the army and to join the illegally established armies in Croatia and Slovenia. Later on, the Muslim leader Alija Izetbegović followed suit. Do you know about that?
If you can't answer it, it seems to me this is a tendentious way of looking at history. What's this to do with the witness's evidence, Mr. Milosevic?
In view of the fact that it is stated in the report, references to a dictatorial regime, to Serbian hegemony, can we infer from that reference to any kind of Serbian hegemony, in view of all these facts, this reference being one of the reasons given for secessionism in Croatia and their nationalist intentions, was just an attempt to find an excuse, because the facts testify to quite the opposite.
The witness can't deal with that. All that she is here to say is that this is what the Croats, many Croats, explained to the people who wrote the report. Now, whether it's right or wrong, I suspect is one of the issues which we may or may not have to try. It sounds like history, and we may not be, therefore, required to decide about it. But, just a moment. All the witness can deal with, and all you can ask her about, is what is in the report. This is what is reported to them. Whether it's right or wrong is not for the witness to say, and there's no point asking any questions to her about it. This is what was reported as the view of many Croats.
That is what I'm talking about, Mr. May, that by selecting information and putting it in a report, a certain picture is drawn, and that picture is totally erroneous. That's what I'm saying. But let us comment on another aspect of the 9th of January report. You say that the Croatian side advocated secession, and in the same report you say that the Serbian side in Croatia wanted to remain in Serbia, that the Serbian authorities and I personally propagated calls to maintain a single Yugoslavia. This is page 2, 4th paragraph. My question is propagating the preservation of the unity of Yugoslavia actually meant preserving the lawful situation according to international law and the Yugoslav constitution? Do you have any awareness of this?
You're on page 2, paragraph 4, did you say?
Yes. In your report of the 9th of January, what I have just quoted, that the Croatian side advocated secession, whereas the authorities in Serbia and I personally advocated the maintenance of Yugoslavia. Of course I did. There is no dispute about that. But my question is it clear to you that that meant advocating the preservation of a legal state of affairs according to international law and the Yugoslav constitution?
I think from your point of view, that's what you advocated, no question. That's true. You wanted to preserve Yugoslavia. And as I said to you yesterday, I am not prepared to speak about national determination or whether it was illegal or illegal secession on the part of Croatia. This is beyond my competence to discuss today.
Yes, but are you aware, and I will quote Article 237 of the Yugoslav Constitution, which envisages, and I quote, it is the inviolable and unalienable right and duty of nations and nationalities of Yugoslavia, the working people and citizens, to protect and defend the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the social order of Yugoslavia as established by the Constitution. End of quote. I assume that that is written in all the constitutions in the world, that the citizens have to defend their country and its territorial integrity. Are you aware of this?
Mr. Milosevic, this is beyond my competence to discuss today.
Very well. But you are talking about rights. You are involved in human rights protection at the highest level, and that is why I'm talking about rights. Do you know, for example, that the Criminal Code of Yugoslavia envisaged as one of the worst...
This is just a waste of time. Now, unless you've got some relevant questions, we'll bring this to an end. You know, you ought to be looking at this indictment, Mr. Milosevic. You look at count 1. That's what this case is about, not erudite discussions about the Constitution. Yes.
Mr. May, I was quoting the report which refers to our support for Yugoslavia and Croatia's secession. So my question is, if we bear in mind the facts that I have mentioned, can we infer that propagating the maintenance of Yugoslavia was not only an expression of our political options and wishes, which is not in dispute, but it was also our constitutional obligation, whereas advocating the breakup of Yugoslavian secession was a crime?
It's not for the witness to answer that question. Maybe an issue which we will have to determine in due course. But it's not for her to deal with it. Now move on to something else. There are matters in the report which you may want to ask about, but your time is going. Concrete matters.
Mr. May, I'm just limiting my comments to her reports and comparing them to the real state of affairs. So I think that my question is quite appropriate. Let me go back to the report again.
Ask questions which relate to the report by all means, but don't indulge in constitutional debate with a witness who can't deal with it. I think the prosecution, are you going to call a constitutional expert who can tell us about this?
We intend to call
just a moment.
Constitutional experts and indeed a historian. The court will remember right from the beginning that Mr. Dopuskovich, from whom a report was at one time expected, said that there ought to be a historian to deal with historical matters. Whether there will be time for all these experts to come in is perhaps another matter, but it's our present intention to call them.
We are talking about human rights here, and this has to do with rights and vital human rights. In the 9th of January report on page 2, paragraph 4, the last sentence says that the Yugoslav army had a strong pan-Yugoslav political orientation. Don't you think it was normal for the Yugoslav People's Army, whose constitutional obligation was to protect the Yugoslav state, to have a Yugoslav orientation? What other orientation could it have had?
Mr. Milosevic, you continue to quote from material which is labeled introduction, background. These are not statements that are under dispute. These are our explanation to readers who may not be at all familiar with the situation of what we were told, what is the background. It is not the substance of the report. We can quibble over the way in which the things are phrased, but I don't think they're really relevant to what the report is about, which is about serious abuses by both sides in this conflict.
Yes, but the question is, if that orientation of the Yugoslav People's Army was pan-Yugoslavia, as you describe it, you yourself say that, then it cannot be pro-Serbian. Don't you see that one excludes the other?
I think you're trying to draw me into the kind of argument I do not intend to get drawn into today.
Your Honors, I should like to say that this is a document that has been exhibited here. It has been tendered into evidence. It may not have any relevance, but the court may base some of its judgments on what is stated in this report. If this has been tendered as an exhibit, then I feel it is natural that it should be the subject of cross-examination, as it may serve as one of the grounds for the court's judgment.
Most certainly, Mr. Topuskovich, but relevant cross-examination, of course. Now, the basis of the report, and the important thing in it, I suggest, is the abuses which it documents, and abuses about which the court is going to have to make judgments. But trying, as the witness rightly describes it, to draw her into constitutional debates, which is outside her expertise, is not a relevant way of spending the time. Now, it's a matter for the accused how he spends his time. If he wastes it on questions like this, of no assistance to the court, then his time goes. It's up to him. But I'm certainly not going to require the witness to try and enter into this sort of argument. Yes, Mr. Milosevic.
Mr. May, I'm relying exclusively on the documents that have been tendered through this witness, so I'm not quoting from any other documents, nor am I relying on any other documents, except on those that have been tendered through this witness. So my next question is it possible to conclude that according to international and domestic law, the legal aspiration of the Serbian authorities and the population in Croatia and also in Bosnia-Herzegovina to preserve Yugoslavia was in conformity with the legal option of the JNA to preserve Yugoslavia and its constitutional obligation to protect the territorial integrity of the country. So, is it possible to draw such a conclusion from these unquestionable facts? Undeniable facts.
I do not intend to answer that question. By not answering it, I'm not saying that I disagree with you or agree with you. I just do not feel this is appropriate for me to discuss at this moment and at this time.
I'm going to confer as to whether we should bring this cross-examination to an end, because it's wasting the time of the court. Very well. Continue, Mr. Milosevic.
In your reports, did you draw the conclusion that the Serbian population in Croatia and the authorities of the Republic of Serbia and the JNA were seen by the Croatian authorities that had opted for secession as enemies, as opponents? Is that in dispute? Is that a debatable fact?
I can't answer. Just say I can't answer.
I guess I really cannot say what was in the minds of the Croatian authorities.
Very well. In the portion of your report of the 9th of January 1991, you described the activities of the police force with the view to seizing weapons from the reserve police and territorial defense in the parts of Croatia where the Serb ethnicity was in the majority. Now, was this directed towards the elimination, in fact, of a segment of the defense, or rather the constitutionally provided for armed forces of Yugoslavia in an area where the population strove for retaining the territorial integrity of the country, which was also pursuant to the constitution?
As the report states, the express intent of the Croatian government was it was an overall action which was to remove weapons from all police stations throughout the country. Our impression was that they focused primarily, at least initially, on areas that had a Serbian population. I think that was a provocative act. I think it was, in our experience, where we documented it, the police were intent on preserving order. They told us they were under instructions not to create violence. However, at that point, there was a serious tension in the air, and I think there was suspicion on both sides that the Croatian police were afraid that Serb population might seize arms from these police stations in their own defense, and I think that the Serbs were afraid that the police were trying to keep them from doing that because they didn't trust them. I think that the propaganda coming from Serbia was stirring up thoughts of war, of persecution, bringing fear into the minds of simple people who had lived for many years in close harmony with their neighbors without concern about whether or not they were Croats or Serbs. I think that this whole ethnic tension was raised not by the people but by the governments, by both governments involved, and that's what led to all of the bloodshed.
Well, that's very, how shall I put it, doubtful, a dubious explanation. If I quote your table, tab number 1, on page 6, or rather the portion of that page, it's all in English and you can follow. It is in the first fresh paragraph of page 6. And you speak about the fact that they had come in to collect up the weapons and that there were Serbian demonstrators. And then you say the following: Serbs who had suffered terribly at the hands of Croatian fascists during World War II
apparently believed that the current arms seizure would put them at the mercy of the Croatian government, a fear that was compounded by the fact that the arms seizure initially were carried out by special Croat-only police units, apparently hastily assembled and trained, and mainly in villages and towns that were predominantly Serbs. The Serbs minority thus saw the seizure as a targeted disarmament and not as a neutral move by the government on a general and non-ethnic basis to reduce the quantity of arms, etc.
I believe that's what I just said in answer to your previous question. I see no disparity between what you just read and my response. I think that both governments took positions and actions that were bound to stir up unrest and fear amongst the population.
Well, now that this kind of practice, the one you talk about, and the fear of that practice being implemented, if you link that up with the observations that we made yesterday and established yesterday from the leadership of the new Croatian authorities to the effect that the independent state of Croatia, the one from World War II, was an expression of the historical aspirations of the Croatian people, and at the same time bringing in members of the Ustasha emigration to top positions in the government, and then the reintroduction of state symbols, the symbols of that same independent state of Croatia. Do you not think that it is logical and that the fear is justified on the part of the Serb population at a point in time when their national rights are being taken away from them from the Constitution and their footing of equality in the Constitution, and then this was followed up by the seizure of arms, which were provided for by that Constitution as a means of defense and one of the instruments of the army of the SFRY. Now, is that something that you are challenging or not?
I'm not challenging what you said, but I would like to point out that at the same time, at the very time that we were inspecting the situation in these Serbian villages where the Croatian police had come to seize the arms, just before that there had been an unofficial referendum amongst the Serbian minority in Croatia that they would not want to become part of a separate Croatian state, and that in Knin, in the area of Knin, they had already taken up arms and were taking over the territory that they occupied. So that I think at least at that moment in history, there seemed to be a reason for both sides to have severe distrust of each other, which was what we were trying to explain in the initial part of the report when we give both the Serb position and the Croat position.
You are endeavoring to draw a symmetry between the perpetrators of crimes and victims of those crimes. But let me draw your attention to page 8 of that document, and at the bottom you say the following: however, Helsinki Watch believes that excessive force was used by Croatian police in, for example, the visit of Vornauni.
There is reason to believe that the intent was to intimidate the Serb population as well as to bring about compliance with the otherwise lawful orders to collect arms. Although the collection of arms was presented as a part of general program of public safety, at least in the early part of the collection program, the burden of the government orders appears to have fallen on the Serb villages alone.
I don't know what the question is. You're reading my words back to me, and I agree with them. I mean, you can take them out of context. I think there was a kind of symmetry at that time.
Well, I didn't take anything out of context. I can't read you the entire report, but that's how it was composed. Now, taking away arms of the reserve police force and territorial defense in areas where the Serb inhabitants were the majority population, I assume you do know that the Croatian authorities justified this by the large representation, percentage-wise, of Serbs in the police force itself. Now, could you answer me this, please? Is there anything that is not normal, not natural, in the fact that in areas where the Serbs make up the majority population, even the vast majority, that most of the policemen there are Serbs, in fact? Was there anything that was not normal or illogical in that?
Not necessarily. I mean, I have no reason to dispute that. I think that we're talking about a situation that was about to erupt into open warfare, and that at that moment in time when I was there, I saw great fear and great distrust on both sides, which is the attitudes of both the Serbian population and the Croatian population, and I saw no effort made by your government or by Mr. Tudjman's government to alleviate those concerns. If anything, it seemed to be, both sides seemed to be generating something that would lead to warfare.
Yes, but let's dwell on the facts for a moment. Let's stay with the facts. And before that, as you deal with human rights, social status, and so on, to be a policeman, is that a special social privilege in any way?
No.
Or do you perhaps consider that the Republic of Serbia or somebody from the structures of pound authority in Serbia were responsible for the facts that in the territory of Croatia, where the vast majority of the population were the Serbs, that the largest number of policemen were precisely of Serb ethnicity or Serb origin? Is that disputed? And through a whole series of years, that was how it was.
I haven't investigated the structure of the police force during those years. I have no reason to dispute what you say, but I don't know that it's accurate or not.
Well, in your report of the 9th of January 1991, in the part you say you wrote yourself, you speak about the fact that the policemen conducted their operations at night and in the early hours of the morning, that they were exclusively Croats, and that they were not properly trained, inadequately trained, and armed to the teeth, as you say. Now, do you not consider that that is sufficient reason for fear on the part of the Serb population?
I think it was a very good reason for fear on the part of the Serb population, and that it was compounded by the fact that they were being told from Belgrade that they were under attack.
Well, you yourself state on page 8 of your report of the 9th of January, in the view of the mission, however, the Croatian government appears to have used inappropriate and intimidating amounts of force in Serb villages.
To carry out its order to collect weapons.
How then is it possible that in your statement on the 4th to the 7th of March on page 3, you say that the fear among the Serbs was in fact caused by propaganda on the part of Serb radio? Answer that question for me, please, if you would.
Both things can exist and did exist at the same time. I also, we say in the report that we interviewed some of these Croat policemen, and although their methods seemed out of proportion to the activity that they were sent there to do, they told us, and they had no reason, these were just ordinary policemen, they had no reason to lie about it, that they were under strict orders not to provoke violence in any way. Perhaps they expected violence, and that's why they were overly armed, but it was an escalating situation, and the fear and the tension was coming from both sides.
And are you aware of the fact that on the 17th of June 1991, the Croatian Party of Rights published the so-called Lipanj or June Charter calling for the revival of the independent state of Croatia on all its, as they say, historical territory, ethnic territory, with its eastern borders along the line of Subotica, Zemun, the Drina River, Sanjak, and the Bay of Kotor, which means that their pretensions were on all the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a large part of Serbia, and part of Montenegro as well. Is that something that you know about?
I'm not aware of it now.
Let's take a look at what you say in tab 3, for example. Tab 3, page 5. You state the following: Grubišno polje, and other villages in Western Slavonia. I have to read this out for the public, because the entire public knows about the horrendous crimes that took place there against the Serb population, and this is what you write. You say, among others, that the Tanjug news agency accused the Croats, but I'll read it as it says, accused Croats of having committed war crimes
against Serbs in the area near to town of Grubišno Polje in Croatia. The allegations were investigated by members of the European Community Monitoring Mission, who found that Serbian forces, not Croat forces, were guilty of summary execution and destruction of civilian property in the area. The monitoring mission's report concludes, I onda ide citat, we established evidence of crimes which were committed by, within brackets, Serbian forces during the 2 and 3 month period that they controlled that particular zone, Western Slavonia. Our term did not find evidence of killing later, nor of the systematic destruction of Serbian property by the Croatian National Guard or Croats from the area. Sad, molim vas, ovdje smo imali čak I
we've even heard here testimony by a very important protected witness, precisely from the area of Western Slavonia. I presented him with a fact, which is common knowledge, a well-known fact, that the forces destroyed 193 Serbian villages in Western Slavonia. And he said to that my figures were incorrect, that was not the figure, and that according to his information, the Croatian forces destroyed only 163 Serb villages. Now, do you know anything about those facts and figures and the crimes committed in Western Slavonia when you put a report of this kind, of the alleged Serb crimes in that place, into your report?
Well, you're quoting from an EC report, a report done by members of the European Community. We put that into our report because it was a respected delegation. I cannot off the top of my head, respond to the figures that you just gave me. I'm sure there are people who have those figures, and, I could go to members of my staff and see if they know the details.
Well, yes, all right. I have quoted the provisions that speak of the composition of the armed forces in Yugoslavia. Do you know that after the operation in which weapons were seized from the territorial defense in Krajina, the next major operation on the part of the Croatian authorities, militarily speaking, was the blocking, encirclement and attacks on barracks of the JNA, the Yugoslav People's Army, which had been positioned there for 50 years, in Croatia, that is. Do you know about that?
Yes, I do. I might not characterize it quite the way you do, but I know that the JNA was stationed there and was seen by I believe by the Croatian government as being sympathetic to the Serbian minority.
Now, about the armed Serb population that took place in the conflicts in Croatia, you speak about them as rebels, and you say this on page 6, paragraph 2 in your statement to the investigators, or you refer to them as paramilitary formations or units. Now, in view of the fact that these forces, as you yourself state in your report of the 9th of January 1991, fought for the preservation of Yugoslavia, do you consider that they were legal and lawful or illegal?
The paramilitary forces, in my view, were illegal, and their actions were most definitely illegal. They committed tremendous crimes that had nothing to do with military behavior, including summary executions of people, looting and robbing in the areas that they took over, and much of that booty, as I understand it, was brought back into Serbia over Serbian borders, which would imply that they had the tacit cooperation of the Serbian government or the Serbian border guards at the very least. Paramilitaries are not an official army, and these particular paramilitaries were documented as having done and committed gross abuses against the civilian population.
Well, do you know anything about the fact that the most horrendous crimes and massive crimes took place in operations by the Croatian army when thousands and thousands of people were killed and hundreds of thousands of people expelled from Croatia? Do you know anything about that at all? Have you read the New York Times? Did you read the New York Times in 1993, in which David Binder says that in this area outside the Krajina, 10,000 Serb houses were blown up by dynamite, and that Croatia has become the purest country, ethnically speaking, in Europe? If you haven't looked at the facts and figures on the ground in the field, I assume that you read the New York Times.
I am not disputing the fact that gross abuses were committed by both sides in this conflict. We have tried to be as even-handed as possible by all sides in the conflict. And you want to call attention, obviously, to what was done by the Croatians. I am not going to dispute the facts with you. I'm just saying that their crimes were committed by the Serbian government, the JNA, which was at that point under the control of the Serbian government, and the vast majority of crimes seem to come from that side, even more than from the Croatian side, although war has a way of making everyone ultimately into criminals.
Well, you haven't got a single piece of information to bear that out, to confirm that something had come from outside. And we're talking about the insurgent Serbs in Croatia, and I quoted the Constitution of Yugoslavia to you and the obligation to protect the territorial integrity of the country. And do you know that, among others, it also says the following: each and every citizen who, by weapons or in any other way, takes part in against an attacker, members of the armed forces of the SFRY, does that, to all intents and purposes, mean, if you look at the law of it, because you deal in humanitarian law, that the people in Krajina who fought to preserve the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia, which is one of the constitutional duties and obligations, did so in keeping with the provision of the Constitution and was therefore a component part of the legal armed forces of that country, formed part of the legal armed forces under the Constitution?
Mr. Milosevic, I'm going to stop you. It's not a matter for the witness. Maybe something we'll ultimately have to decide. Now, your time is very nearly up, but we'll give you another 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. May, I have done my best to reduce the number of questions as much as possible. I can be quite frank and say that I did do so because I have been submitted with many reports here, and I would need many more days to uncover the background of reports of this kind that fan the flames, in fact, of an anti-Serbian campaign. But I do have a few more things to ask the witness. I assume that you will give me the time to do so. You, in your report of September 1991, wrote that in May 1991, the National Guard was set up to serve as a Republican army. And then in the footnote on page 24 and 5 of your report, you state the following: the National Guard Corps is not a part of the police force and therefore not under the control of the Ministry of the Interior. The National Guard Corps was set up about 3 months ago and serves as a Croatian army and is responsible to the Croatian Defense Ministry. But during the fighting with the Serbian insurgents, as you call them, the National Guard and Croatian police worked together in cohorts, and you note yourself that the object of these forces was to ensure secession, a breakaway from the SFRY, and we quoted Tudjman's statements of the 18th of October, which relate to this, and when he called the people to arms in order to defend the country's independence. Therefore, if we bear in mind the constitutional provisions and these facts which you yourself state and set out here, can you tell me the following? Which are the illegal paramilitary forces that we're talking about, in fact, here? The ones that are protecting Yugoslavia and its constitutional order, or those which engaged in violent secession?
Our role is to document the abuses committed by these illegal paramilitary forces. The ones that came from Serbia were particularly heinous in the crimes that they committed, and we have documented them in these reports and in other reports which went on into the Bosnian struggle. I'd like to say also that I take strong exception to your implication that we are fanning anti-Serb sentiments. This was not our intent. Our reports were as to the greatest degree possible even-handed, and it is not our responsibility if the vast majority of the crimes were committed by troops under your command.
Dobro.
All right, let's move on. I have to skip some of my questions, but in that same report, you also say that although the presidency was the highest organ in Yugoslavia, to send a letter to the presidency would mean nothing because I am the one who did all the decision-making. That's what you claim, at least. Now, before this institution, certain witnesses have also testified about the fact that at its meeting, and this is an undisputed fact, of the 12th to the 14th of March, 1991, the presidency meeting went on for 2 days. The Yugoslav state presidency, as the Supreme Command, in its capacity of Supreme Command, rejected the proposal by the staff of the Supreme Command to raise the level of combat alert for the JNA because of the deteriorated political and security situation in the country. Now, could you answer me this, please? As that is a fact, which is in complete contradiction with what you're claiming, if I, as you say, was the one who made the decisions, was that my will to reject the proposal of the staff of the Supreme Command, or perhaps the staff of the Supreme Command was following my orders and rejected it following orders from me, perhaps? Whereas the fact remains that the proposal was rejected to raise the level of alert for the army because of the deteriorated situation. At that same Yugoslav state presidency meeting, who was in command of that same army, which you claim that I was commanding?
Can you answer that or not?
I was not at the meeting. I can only say what the general impression by informed people inside and outside of Yugoslavia at that point was, and it was that when people talked about orders from Belgrade, that they came from you and not from the presidency. And regardless of what happened at that meeting, I would like to ask you what actually happened in practice.
Yes, but answer me a simple question. If I did indeed have control over the JNA, how come I couldn't influence the decision to raise its combat readiness, for example? How would that be possible then?
Did you actually listen to the decision that was made? I don't know.
All right, let's move on. In your statement given between the 4th and 7th of March, you speak of the displacement of the non-Serb population from Baranja, and we had a witness here testifying before you who said that nobody ever expulsed anyone from Baranja, and they even called on them to come back, and this was a prosecution witness, not my own witness. And you speak of the displacement of the non-Serb populations and settlement in the areas of the displaced Serbs who had fled from Western Slavonia in November. I quote you there. And you speak about some 20,000 Serbs who had fled. And it is awful if even one man has to flee from his own home, regardless of which ethnicity he belongs to. But my question to you is the following. Is it possible that in your statement and in your letter, you express concern only for the non-Serb population because these people are settling into the area, so the ones who have left won't have anywhere to return, whereas the destiny and fate of those 20,000 who did not leave from any other reason but from the need to leave because they were suffering and had to leave, you're not interested in that at all. You're not interested who they were fleeing from, why they had to flee. You're just looking at them as a danger, because as a threat, because you say that they will come to settle Baranja and then...
Unmanageable. And insofar as there's a question there at all, and the first sentence is misleading and doesn't accurately reflect the evidence.
Mr. Milosevic, this will be your last question. Now, would you like to rephrase it in a way that the witness can answer? And it is your last, because you've now had well over the time.
So you will allow me just one more question, is that right?
Yes.
Well, then I would like to deal with one more topic with several questions, if I may, Mr. May, because in page 8 of the statement given to the prosecution, in paragraphs 3 and 4, you said that I refused to hand over 3 officers to this institution, JNA officers, being accused of an alleged killing of 200 persons at Ovčara near Vukovar, and I didn't respect Yugoslavia's international obligations. Do you mean the obligations provided for by the statute of this institution adopted by the UN Security Council at its in 1993?
Are you talking about the tribunal?
Yes, yes.
No, the tribunal did not exist at the time that we sent our letter to you.
Now, do you consider that the observation is correct that the member states of the United Nations are duty-bound to respect and implement the decisions of the UN Security Council only if they are in conformity with the UN Charter? Is that so or not?
I think you're getting me into a question of international law once again.
Do you consider that this institution, in which you are testifying now, was set up in conformity with the United Nations Charter and pursuant to it?
This is well away from anything that the witness can possibly answer. Yes, Mr. Trpuskovic.
Thank you, Your Honours. I'm sorry, Mr. May, that you won't give me just a few more minutes to raise some rather important questions. Your Honours, out of everything that the prosecution has tendered as evidence through this witness, I should like to ask the witness to explain a few things stated in tab 4
Exhibita 359.
of Exhibit 359.
To je ova izjava, odnosno to je ovaj dokument koji je ispisan rukom gospođe Jerry Leiber.
By Miss Jerry Leiber. Miss Jerry Leiber, could you please tell me the following? I have reviewed this document, and I have noticed, actually both of us, my colleague and myself, that
između 8. I 34 stranice,
between page 8 and 34, on 27 pages, in other words, after page 8 comes the 34th page. How can you explain the pages missing from this document? Did you hand the entire document to the prosecution consisting of all the pages? And why are 27 pages missing?
Well, that's very easy to explain. There were 2 meetings and in between them, we did other things. They didn't take place consecutively. Page 2 was the meeting with Mr. Pujic and Petkovic and Lieutenant General Vojvodic. And if you'll see at the beginning of page 34, it says Foreign Ministry. So this was the beginning of a new set of notes that I was taking. In between, I have all of the notes at home, but for this purpose, I took out only the ones that dealt with our official meetings. Presumably, we went somewhere else in between, spoke to people. I took things down in my notebook. Is that clear?
Those pages maybe contain something that could be useful for Mr. Slobodan Milošević. Why didn't you hand the complete document to the prosecution, and then it will be up to the prosecution to judge?
Because my notes, which probably numbered in hundreds of pages from my notebooks, I was interviewing people throughout that mission, talking to journalists, talking to witnesses. Some of the material was probably confidential. None of it related to this particular set of meetings. What I was asked to provide were my notes, and I provided them, my complete notes, which are provided here from the official meetings that I had when I was in Belgrade. And the first meeting is from page 2 to page 8. There's nothing missing in between. And the second meeting begins on page 34. And it is again numbered consecutively until it ends on page 36. I see no discrepancy there whatsoever.
Hvala.
Thank you.
Časni sudije,
Your Honors,
u vezi ove teme ja nemam više pitanja, ali
I have no more questions regarding this particular issue, but to be able to put any additional questions to the witness, I should like to ask the documents to be shown to you, which I have received as exculpatory evidence on the basis of Rule 68. The first one is 013998, and the component part of that document is 013999. This is the ERN number. That is one document. And the second document is 0013625. And the third document is 0028936. And I have only a single point to address linked to these documents.
What are the documents, please? Can you tell us what they are?
These are documents which we received under the provisions of Rule 68. These are very important documents.
I know that. Just what is the nature of them? What are they headed?
It has to do with investigations that were conducted by Ms. Leiber in connection with rape of Muslims, Croat and Serb women. So this is a very important issue, and one that is part of the indictment, and it reflects on the method of work applied by this organization and some very important facts that Ms. Leiber can testify about.
Your Honor, if the amici wish to produce documents in their examination of witnesses, they have to produce them in copies. We don't carry everything on our trolleys. You simply can't find something like that. I'm sorry.
Yes. Have you got a copy? Yes.
I have.
Very well. Now, let us have a look at it, and then the witness can have it.
Naročito zadnja dva dokumenta.
The last two documents in particular.
U ovom prvom se navodi izjava
The first contains a statement by Ms. Leber.
Mr. Tapskovic, why don't you make photocopies in advance in the future, in this kind of case?
Da, hoću, ali to je dokaz koji sam dobio pre 2 dana.
But this is an exhibit that was given to me 2 days ago. Believe me, I had to have it translated, and it was rather difficult to organize all this. Keep all this in mind, but you will see that it is highly relevant.
Naročito zadnja 2 dokumenta.
Especially the last 2.
Yes, the matter could be put to the witness, and perhaps he can go on the Elmo as a way of making sure everybody sees it.
I won't take time. Thank you very much. I won't take any more time. It's passing all too quickly. I'll deal with it on the overhead projector.
Ms. Leber, would you look, please? This document will be put on the projector. It'll come up on your screen. If you need to look at it more closely, you can, of course, take it. Now, Mr. Tapskovic, what is it that you would like to ask the witness about?
Can I make this brighter?
Prvo, ako može gospođa Leber da mi potvrdi
da je ona radila first of all confirm for me that she was working on the field and conducting investigations in connection with
Excuse
rape.
me for a moment. I can't read what is on this. Is it possible to make it brighter?
It may be easier if you look at it on the Elmo beside you.
Oh, fine.
Might be the easiest way to see it if you can't see.
Thank you. I'm sorry, would you start again?
Dakle, moje pitanje je,
My question
kao smo čuli, već ste to kazali da ste radili na istragama,
with reference to what you have already said, that you were involved in investigations into the crime of rape on the territory of the former Yugoslavia. Isn't that right?
Yes, that is correct.
I jedan od razloga zbog
one of the reasons for your organization to request sanctions was what you reported regarding rape.
That is correct.
A da li ste, obzirom na to da ste se bavili silovanjima
of the fact that you investigated rape, the rape of Serb women, did you ask for sanctions to be imposed on Croatia by the same token?
I don't think we talked about sanctions at all in this context.
Hvala. A sad,
Thank you.
molim vas, gospođo Leber, ako možete da pogledate
could you please
druga 2 dokumenta,
look at 2 other documents drafted by you. They are in the same group. Turn 2 pages, and then you will come across 2 documents compiled by you.
Tako, to je vaš dokument.
It's your document, isn't it?
To je isto ono što...
Wait a moment. First of all, I don't recognize any of these documents. What is the first one? Bosnian falsehoods on rape rejected. Whose document is this?
Ne. Onda vi ne vidite dobro. Dokument, to je zapisnik koji ste vi napravili o saslušanju jedne žrtve.
That you drafted after hearing the testimony of a victim.
Izvinite, molim vas.
Are we talking about the first document now?
Ne.
Because I'm quoted in that document, and that's an incorrect quote. I don't know where it comes from.
Ja vas molim.
Would you please be kind enough to turn 2 pages?
Nakon toga dolazi dokument koji ste vi napravili.
And then you will come across the document that you compiled. Isn't that so?
Yes, that is correct. This is from an article that I wrote in the New York Review of Books. It was entitled Bosnia Questions About Rape.
Molim vas. Ovaj dokument ste vi napravili na osnovu vašeg intervjua jedne
on the basis of an interview with the Serbian woman who was a victim. Is that so?
The article that I wrote was contained interviews with a number of women, including, I believe, 3 Serbian women who were victims, and also Croat women, and also Bosnian women. Bosnian Muslim women.
Ja ne znam da li vi to dobro vidite tu, to je dokument koji ste vi napravili, ispitivali ste jednu svjedokinju, imate ovdje ime, prezime, koliko godina ima, i kako se zove, čak ja neću da navedem njeno ime i prezime, nema potrebe, koja je čak rekla vama da je spremna da to kaže pred televizijskim kamerama, koji je silovalo 7 Hrvata, izgubila je svest žena, a silovana je njena rođaka od 9 godina.
And her 9-year-old cousin was also raped. Did you talk to that woman?
Yes, I did.
Ako ste razgovarali sa tom ženom, tu postoje svi podaci o tome i to može naravno tako da se eventualno iskoristi u postupku pred ovim tribunalom, pošto ste vi vodili intervju identičan kako ga vode istražitelji ovog tribunala. Da li ili ne?
in an identical manner as is done by the investigators of this tribunal.
Yes, what is the question?
Sve ovo što ste čuli od žrtve, to je
all that you heard from the victim is something that you yourself heard directly. So I consider that such testimony can be very useful. This is what you yourself heard from the victim.
Yes.
The witness agrees with that.
I'm...
Any further questions, Mr. Boskovic?
U stvari zanima me da li u svim drugim slučajevima, na osnovu čega ste radili izveštaj,
whether in all other cases, on the basis of which you drew up your report, you have similar documents like this one, which you used as a basis for your report.
Are you talking now about the report on rape or reports in general?
In general, your report and your positions, the positions upheld of your organization as contained in those reports.
I would say that, yes, this is not untypical, except that in many cases we do not have the person's name. So in this case, these Serbian victims were actually brought to our attention by the Serbian government's official Commission on War Crimes. And they produced witnesses who were prepared to speak openly and publicly and to give their names and had no compunction about having it be used. In those cases, of course, we have documents exactly like that. In other cases, we don't even know ourselves the real name of the person because they refuse to give it to us. And in other cases, we have the name of the person, but we don't use it in official reports because we promised not to.
Hvala.
Thank you.
Hvala, gospođo Leber. Sad imamo ovaj prvi dokument.
Let us go back to the first document now.
Please.
Članak novinski.
This is a newspaper article, and you made a statement there. I would like to ask you whether you made that statement. And on the left-hand side, you will see.
Sa vaše desne strane.
No, rather on your right-hand side.
Piše rubrika 1, lažne optužbe.
There's a heading called false accusations.
Fakta.
And then on the other side, facts.
Naslov je
and the heading is Bosnian untruths about rape rejected. Rape has become a component part of malicious propaganda, Peter Jennings. And now these false accusations are given. First, December 92, Muslim leaders in Bosnia accused Bosnian Serbs of raping 50,000 Muslim women in camps where they held them. Isn't that what it says there? Then again, in December, Newsweek says that in Bosnia there were almost as many victims of rape. And then there is a draft report of the Council of Europe relying on sources from Germany referring to 20,000 Muslim women. And then comes the point, New York Times and other publications make accusations that Serb soldiers were given orders to rape. Do you remember that?
I remember the entire climate at that time. Yes, I do.
Now we come to the facts listed there, and it says, on behalf of the International Red Cross, Mr. Philip Meisers, there is no evidence that such camps exist, nor that they ever existed. Then there's your statement as well. Amnesty International says there is no evidence of that again, and asked by a reporter of NBC, Peter Jennings, whether members of the Serbian army were issued orders to rape.
Jerry Labor,
heading
Helsinki
Watch, answered there wasn't a single piece of evidence to confirm that. Did you state that? And in your work, by your organization, did you indeed establish that there was not a single shred of evidence to prove this?
In our work, we determined that rape was committed extensively by all sides in the conflict, that women were victims, Serbian women, Muslim women, and Croatian women were all victims, and I personally interviewed people from each nationality. I was concerned at the time, our organization was concerned, that the numbers had escalated probably beyond the actual fact. 50,000, the number 50,000 was being bandied about by various organizations, and I believe that when I spoke to Mr. Jennings on television, I tried to make it clear that although vast numbers of rapes had taken place, it was a mistake to exaggerate the number because it would destroy the credibility of the reports altogether.
That is not my question, Ms. Leber. I'm sorry, what I'm asking you is about this statement of yours, which is of essential importance for these proceedings and for the judges.
The statement.
That you made a statement as to whether members of the Serbian army were given orders to rape. And your answer was, when Jennings put this question to you, that there is no evidence to confirm that members of the army were given orders to rape. That is what you stated.
That statement is probably true. I did not have evidence that they were given orders. However, I did have evidence that the actions were committed.
Vi znate nakon toga, to je drugo nešto, ali vi znate i završiti sa mojim unakrašnim ispitivanjem, ali vi znate da je nakon toga komesar Ujedinjenih nacija za ratne zločine odbio da prihvati te statistike, a zvaničnici Saveta Evrope
and officials in the Council of Europe first emphatically condemned such accusations, unfounded accusations. Is that correct? Do you remember that both representatives of the Council of Europe and the United Nations condemned these figures which did not correspond to the truth? Yes or no?
I myself felt that the figures were exaggerated, but I wish you had brought as part of your evidence the actual article that I wrote, which is referred to in these papers, because I do describe camps and where women were held and raped, and I do say that it was hard to believe that this kind of activity could have been conducted by Serbian soldiers without the complicity of the officers in charge and presumably the people who commanded them. I could not produce an order in writing to say that they had been commanded to do this.
Yes, but you said something quite else. You said that you didn't have any evidence of that. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I have some questions.
Do you want to ask some questions about those documents first, otherwise they can go back?
One question arising, but not about the documents themselves.
So the usher can return the document.
Ms. Leber, do you have with you the article to which you refer and that covers the question of rape?
I actually have it in my hotel room. I do not have it on my person.
May we have that exhibited in due course? If I can have a number associated with it, it's clearly relevant and arises from the questioning of the amicus.
Yes. It could be marked for identification for the moment, but we'll give it a number.
If I can, maybe I can get it before the end of today's session, otherwise on Wednesday.
Okay, that'll be Prosecutor's Exhibit 360 then.
Just a few other questions. Broadly speaking, Ms. Leber, in reverse form, or not in reverse form, dealing with matters today and then matters yesterday. Did the accused, to your knowledge, take any steps to hand over for trial those named as responsible for the Vukovar massacre?
I have no knowledge that he did.
Dealing with questions about his as opposed to federal responsibility, apart from the passage in the letter from his chef de cabinet, Goran Milinovic, was there ever any denial in correspondence or communications to you that the accused was the person with authority to whom you could, as you did, turn?
No, there was not.
It was suggested in one long passage by the accused that contained no discrete question that you had no single piece of information to say that something came from outside, and I think the implication was that you held no single piece of information to suggest that there was influence from Serbia or indeed from the accused on events in Croatia. Do you accept that proposition or not?
Could you repeat the question? I'm not sure.
If I understood it correctly, then it is to the effect that you have no piece of information to suggest that there was influence from Belgrade on events in Croatia. Do you accept that proposition?
No, I don't accept that.
A newspaper article headed Why Keep Yugoslavia as One Country, which you say was a title incorrectly applied to an article of yours. Can you just summarize how a passage of what you wrote in that article was so misinterpreted by the headline writer?
Well, the article was written at a time when Yugoslavia was still a federation, and in the course of our mission, it became clear to us in various ways that the federal presidency was extremely weak, and that the Serbian government was the power in charge. And in trying to influence, we were particularly concerned then, as you recall, with the situation we saw in Kosovo. And in trying to influence that situation, we urged the U.S. government, we addressed the U.S. government in our article and urged them to apply economic sanctions against the presidency and, in as much as was possible, against the Republic of Serbia. But rather than to punish the entire country, because we felt that there were parts of other republics where behavior was respectful of human rights, and we also pointed to Croatia as a possible culprit, and that we should also watch what was happening. The U.S. government should also watch what was happening there. I think that by trying to target U.S. aid rather to certain parts of the country, the person who wrote the headline misunderstood what we were saying and was saying that why keep the country at all.
One matter of detail, the Chamber may be assisted in comprehension by looking at the Atlas, pages 20 and 21. D3, which is absolutely in the center of the page. I don't need trouble the witness with it. And at D3 on the bottom you can see Bosanski Novi, fairly large, and immediately above it Dvor. And then further up that road, and indeed up the river valley, you can see Bosanska Kostanica, and you can see the number of villages that lie between the two. And with that geographical assistance, if it is appropriate, would the witness and perhaps the Chamber turn to tab 2 at page 20. There was, in fact, the relevant passage on which criticism was based starts at page 19 under the heading Shooting at Medical Vehicle and Personnel Denial of Treatment to the Wounded and Holding Medical Personnel Hostage. Do you have that passage, Ms. Labour?
Yes, I do.
And then the passage that was the subject of complaint by the accused is on page 20 in the middle, where he said you couldn't identify small villages between the two towns I've spoken of on the map. And the further complaint was in respect of page 21, where there was reference to yellow camouflage uniforms. Without going into it in detail, an allegation that is detailed over in excess of 2 sides, does that seem to you to be a fairly detailed allegation or not?
Yes, it was.
The Chamber can read it for itself with the map in mind to see if there's anything in the complaints by the accused. But in any event, it's worth bearing in mind that this appears in tab 2, which is one of your generally published reports. When we turn to the complaints made against the accused at tab 3, to which his response was requested and never forthcoming from him personally, do we see that that particular allegation is not reflected there in any event? Perhaps the Chamber will accept that from me. The allegations in tab 3, as I read it, do not include the medical personnel set out in the earlier one. If I've missed it, my mistake and nobody else's. I don't think it's in tab 3, Ms. Labour.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Finally, on the meetings you had when you attempted to make tab 3 available to the accused and were met by others, the meeting with the 2 men, including Kostunica at the ministry, did they assume responsibility for the matters in hand and of which you were speaking?
That was the impression we got at the time. I mean, we didn't ask to see them. We asked to see a spokesman for the government. They were the people who were provided to us. I do not recall their identifying themselves as opposition politicians, if that in fact is what they were. They spoke on behalf of the government.
And if we look at your notes in tab 4, the very passage to which Mr. Dopuskević drew your attention on page 34 of your notes.
Yes.
We see that your notes of this part of your meetings begins with Foreign Ministry. He seems to want to pass responsibility to the army.
Mm-hmm.
You remember who was seeking to pass responsibility to the army?
You mean which of the 2 people?
Yes.
In respect to,
If not, it doesn't matter.
I really don't. I mean, I'd have to guess, because as you see here, I didn't even get their names until the very end of the interview. And I notice here now that I have in very small writing here Democratic Party President and Vice President, so they obviously did identify themselves in that way.
Very much. And they nevertheless were making observations of the type we see, seeking to pass responsibility for events to one body or another.
Mm-hmm. In general, the conversation with these 2 gentlemen was less hardline, I think, than the previous interview, but then foreign ministry conversations usually are.
Here's my questions of this witness.
I just have an objection, not regarding the witness, but regarding an unnatural link that Mr. Nice has made in his question regarding war crimes and the reference to the letter of my chef de cabinet, Milinkovic. It's an objection that I should like to enter into the record. May I make it?
I think very briefly, Mr. Milosevic.
Very briefly, it won't take more than a minute. Mr. Nice has linked up a statement that Yugoslavia refused to extradite 3 officers to this court with the letter of my chef de cabinet, point 2, in which he says the President of the Republic of Serbia has asked the competent organs of the Republic of Serbia to investigate abuses referred to in your letter, and in the case that any citizen of the Republic of Serbia took part in those crimes, he will be put on trial. trial. The implication is that he would be tried in Yugoslavia on the basis of the Yugoslav Criminal Code as a Yugoslav citizen if he is the perpetrator of a crime. And that is quite different from our position that this tribunal is illegal, and of course I would not extradite anyone. These are two completely different things. And it is my obligation, my duty by the Constitution, and also my international obligation, to say to an illegal tribunal that has not been established by...
It's no good addressing us on your alleged illegality. We've already ruled on that ages ago. Ms. Lebo, that concludes your evidence. Thank you for coming to the International Tribunal to give it. You are free to go.
Your Honour, just one thing, of course, it was the first sentence, or the first numbered paragraph of that letter that I had in mind in the question that I was making, not the second. The next witness will be taken by Ms. Retzlaff after the break. Can I simply make this point? I've been very slow to interrupt the cross-examination of this witness. We're going to be looking in due course at the timetable problems that we are facing. The prosecution has a real interest in time, of course, not being used by the accused in a way that denies us further evidence, and I will invite the Chamber in due course to consider carefully the way the accused has used time on this cross-examination as an example of time that is being misused by him.
He has a right to cross-examine. It's one which must be defended. He is a litigant in person, but on the other hand, we of course bear in mind that some of the questions which he asks are totally irrelevant. He has to be controlled, and that is what the trial chamber will do. But we note what you say about time, and we will return to it next week, I anticipate. All right. Do you want to? There's a matter we're going to raise in private session. I'm sorry, Ms. Labour. You should have gone ages ago.